Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon, and hopefully the meal is great and everybody is relaxing because we have a phenomenal guest today, and it is an absolute honor to be up here to introduce him. So, the ambassador currently is the president, right, and CEO of the U.S. Asian Business Council. Founded in 1984, the council represents 175 of the largest American businesses in Southeast Asia. So he joined the U.S. Foreign Service in 1989. His first assignment was in Manila from 89 to 1991, and other assignments he had included the Vatican City and the United Nations. As a diplomat for 30 years, the ambassador served as a U.S. ambassador to Vietnam from 2014 to 2017. Leading a team of 900, the ambassador devised and implemented strategies that deepen economic, security, and cultural ties between our two countries. After his departure from government, he joined the Google Asia Pacific as Vice President for Government Affairs and Public Policy, covering 19 Asian nations from Google's Singapore headquarters. Earlier, he was the senior advisor at the Albright Stonebridge Group and the first vice president of the Fulbright University in Vietnam. He also was the associate professor at the National War College and senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He also was the first U.S. ambassador to receive the Order of Friendship from the President of Vietnam. He serves on the Asia Foundation's Board of Trustees and is a member of the American Academy of Diplomacy. Now, before I get to the book part, I found out a little interesting tidbit that you actually had your vows renewed by the late, great Justice Ginsburg. Wow, absolutely wow. In October of 2021, he published the most recent book, Nothing is Impossible, America's Reconciliation with Vietnam, with a foreword by former Secretary of State, John Kerry, covering the two countries' 25 journey from adversaries to friends and partners. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round of applause and welcome our guest speaker today, former Ambassador.
Thank you, Roland. That was very kind and very generous. And Masha, thank you. Special thanks to my friend Stan Harsha, who's organized my visit to Colorado, and Karen, who's not here right now, but is here in spirit. And Jeff Cooper, thanks very much for the support of the Patriots Foundation and, of course, Tiemann's Foundation for this event, and Fountain Valley. Very nice to see you here. And I want to acknowledge a special friend who's here today. Dick Celeste was governor of Ohio, president of Colorado College, ambassador to India, head of the Peace Corps. The list goes on. A man who's contributed so much to his country and to the world. It's really an honor, sir, that you're here today. Thank you. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the book, and then a little bit about business in Southeast Asia, and then see if there are any questions I can answer. And I'd be very happy to tell about RBG and her visit as well, if that's of interest. But I'm going to start with a plane flight, a Boeing 757 flight in February 1991. Now, remember what was happening in 1991? Desert Storm. And this plane was carrying a congressional delegation of a bipartisan delegation of senators who were going to check out and report on what had happened in Kuwait and Iraq after Desert Storm. And seated on this plane were two senators who came from different parties, John McCain and John Kerry. They didn't actually particularly like one another. John McCain had campaigned against John Kerry. They were pretty much on the opposite sides of almost every big issue that they dealt with. But they were put in seats right adjacent to one another, and they didn't really have much choice. They had to talk. And so that night, they started a conversation which not only lasted all night, the whole entire trip, but lasted for decades. And it was the beginning of a bipartisan friendship that I think made a really big difference to the United States and certainly to Vietnam. They had come to, they were both veterans, Vietnam vets, both Navy, but one, John McCain, was the son and grandson of admirals. And I think went to his grave believing that if we just prosecuted the war harder, we could have won. John Kerry, on the other hand, had come back and became really famous as an anti-war protester. He threw away his Purple Heart and his other medals and protested the war very actively. And actually that's what led him to a political career. So they had very different experiences of the war. And let me tell you just a little bit about John McCain's experience of the war to set the stage. When he was in his early 30s, he flew an F-4 over Truc Bac Lake, which is in downtown Hanoi. And he was aiming to destroy an electric plant on the shores of the lake when he was shot down. Now the process of ejecting from a plane that's been hit, that's about to crash, is a very violent one. Even by the time he had ejected from the pilot's seat, he had broken both arms and his leg. And then he hit the water very hard, and then was pulled ashore by some Vietnamese fishermen. And you know what? They didn't have his best interests in mind. He had been dropping bombs on their city, on their homes, on their neighborhoods. And by the time he got to shore, his bone was protruding through the skin, and he had been bayoneted in the groin. And he was dragged off to a place called Hoa Lo, which means fiery furnace in Vietnamese. We often refer to it as the Hanoi Hilton, and it was a really rough place. And he spent 6.5 years in the Hanoi Hilton. And as I mentioned, he'd been badly wounded, and he did not receive medical attention in the Hanoi Hilton. He didn't receive anesthetics. And by the time he was dragged before the warden in June of 1968, in June, 6 months after he had been shot down, 1968, he was shrunk down to about 100 pounds. And his fellow prisoners had kept him alive. The only way he was still alive was the support of his fellow prisoners. And there was one in particular who was in the cell next to him, a guy named Bob Craner, who really he credits with saving his life. Anyway, he was dragged before the warden. By this time, the Vietnamese had figured out who he was. They knew who his father was. His father was in charge of the entire Pacific Fleet out of Hawaii. So they knew they had an asset in this young lieutenant who was their prisoner. And the warden said, "Lieutenant, you may go free." And McCain said, "Let me think about it." And he went back to his cell and he talked to his friend Bob Craner, and he said, "Bob, the code of conduct says the first prisoner to go in is the first one to go out. I can't be free just based on who my father is. That's not my duty. That would not be honorable. I can't do that." And Bob said, "John, if you stay in prison, you'll die. You're exempt. You do not have to follow the code if it's going to kill you. You should go. And McCain went back to the warden and said, nope, I'm staying. And why do I tell you this story? I think that was the moment when he became the man he was, when he made that decision of duty over his own survival, because he really was not expected to live. But he chose duty first. And when I was proposed to be the 6th U.S. ambassador to Vietnam, who did I go see? I went and saw John McCain. I knew, and I was thinking about politics. I knew that if he supported me for ambassador, I would get to go. It was my dream job to go to Vietnam as ambassador. Dream come true to even be considered. So I went to him and I sought his support. And he said, Ted, you have my support. I've already spoken to Pete Peterson, the first ambassador to Vietnam, who was in the Hoa Lo prison with me. He vouches for you. You're the guy. But he said, let me tell you something. And he took me by the arm and he walked me over to the wall in his office where there was a framed telegram from the Paris peace talks. And in that telegram, the report had gone back to Washington. Admiral McCain's son was offered the opportunity to leave the Hanoi Hilton, and he refused. This sentence was highlighted in the telegram, and I knew this story. You know, I'd read about what had happened to John McCain, so I wondered, why is he showing me this? And only later did it really occur to me. He was telling me who he was. He was telling me about the most important decision of his life, and one that actually, I believe, led to the stories that I tell in my book, because there were heroes, there were people who took great risks to turn two former enemies into friends. And he was one of those heroes. He's one of the better known. And I write stories in my books about people who are much less well known and who took huge risks. John McCain, who'd spent 6.5 years as a POW, was pelted with eggs and tomatoes for his decision to try to normalize relations, diplomatic relations with Vietnam. John Kerry was attacked as well. But I think the greatest vitriol among the veterans community was directed at John McCain. They said he was a Manchurian candidate and a traitor to his country. He wasn't, I'll tell you. That he had made a decision that came directly out of his sense of duty to what he didn't particularly like Vietnam. It didn't come from a sense of warmth. It came from a sense of, it's better for the United States if we move past where we are and we create a new relationship with this old enemy. And so he and John Kerry, on that night in February 1991, when they were stuck next to each other on the plane, they said, well, how can we move past where we are? This was the era of, people talked about Americans being held in tiger cages in Southeast Asia, Americans being held against their will even after the war was over. It was the time of the Rambo films. Ronald Reagan and most of his party were opposed to diplomatic normalization. But Kerry and McCain, in this bipartisan way, set up a committee on POW MIA affairs to prove a negative, to prove that there weren't people being held against their will. They looked through millions of documents. They made multiple visits to Vietnam, even climbing under Uncle Ho's tomb to look into the archives that were preserved there. And they were able to prove to all but the craziest of the crazies that there were no prisoners being held in Southeast Asia, and that opened the possibility of a diplomatic normalization. And I think it's kind of a remarkable story for a number of reasons. It talks about its duty and country, but also a bipartisan friendship. Two people who came from very different perspectives, but had a common vision of what was in America's interest. And I was privileged to be able to kind of build on what they did. Now, I'd be very happy to talk about RBG, but first I want to tell you just a little bit about business in Southeast Asia. When I first went to Vietnam in 1996, there were about $800,000 in two-way trade. Definitely less than $1 million in two-way trade between our two countries. Last year, 2022, $130 billion. Vietnam has gone from one of the poorest nations in Asia to our 7th largest trading partner. It's a lower middle income country at this point. When I first went, it was all bicycles. And you go there now and there are Hermes shops and Louis Vuitton and a lot of Mercedes on the road. It's changed rapidly, really dramatically and rapidly. And in a way, that's kind of the story of Southeast Asia these days. Roland mentioned that I run the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. There is more American investment in the 10 countries of Southeast Asia than in China, India, Japan, and Korea combined. And why is that? There's a phenomenal story of growth. Vietnam grew over 7% last year, is expected to repeat that performance this year. Indonesia over 5%, Philippines over 5%, Malaysia over 5%. In terms of America's top trade partners, six of the 10 nations in Southeast Asia are in the top 22 trade partners of the United States. And by 2030, ASEAN collectively will be the 3rd largest economy in the world. So it's growing fast, it's a dynamic region. It's not always an easy place to do business, and that's where we come in, and we help companies, large and small, do business in that part of the world. But companies are smart. I mean, they see where innovation is occurring. 25 unicorns or decacorns in the IT industry in Indonesia last year, because they've created an innovation ecosystem based around fine universities and innovative people who studied in the United States as well, who have turbocharged that IT economy. It's a very young population. The fastest growing internet economies in the world are in places like Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines. So it's dynamic, it's interesting, and I'd be really happy to answer questions about that, about ASEAN and what's happening there for those of you who might be interested. But I would first like to take questions, and if anyone wants to ask about RBG, I'll answer. Please.
Could you comment or discuss the human rights and the form of government and its sustainability of Vietnam?
Thank you. So the toughest thing I had to deal with during my time in Vietnam was the challenge of human rights. It's a communist country. Now it's a communist country in that it's a one-party state. There is only one political party, and that's the party that calls the shots. It's the Communist Party of Vietnam. There is no free press in Vietnam. But the trends are actually towards more openness. When I first went there almost 30 years ago, there was no internet. And so it was very hard to figure out ever what was going on in the country. And what I found when I returned was that you could say almost anything you wanted to say on Facebook. And so I had about 1 million Facebook fans. And I would reach over the government and reach out to people. And every morning I had a language teacher who would help me hone my pronunciation. And I would see what people were saying and how they were commenting back. And various times I thought, because I would speak out often on human rights, I would think, well, they're going to shut me down now, and they never did. They, I think, had decided that if you want to grow your economy and you want innovation, you need to leave the internet open. And so there were some limits. Sometimes bloggers would get arrested. Sometimes a labor activist would get beaten up. And sometimes a human rights lawyer would get thrown into prison. And I went after them all the time because there was a really bad habit underway a big high-level visitor would come, they would release a political prisoner would show up at Dulles Airport, get a lot of photos taken, and it would have gone into exile, and they put somebody else in jail. And that I found very frustrating. I thought, this is not a game I want to play. So I used to carry in my pocket a card, a laminated card, and on one side were a list of political prisoners that the United States thought needed to be released. And during my time, we were able to get most of them released because we had the leverage of a trade agreement, a pending trade agreement with Vietnam. And on the other side were the systemic changes that I thought needed to be made. The changes to the criminal code, the changes to the law on religion and belief. And because I thought, then we won't have this kind of conveyor belt of activists, but systemic changes that bring Vietnam's laws and practices into accord with its own constitution. Vietnam has a very progressive constitution promulgated in 2013. And the concept that we have is you made these commitments in your constitution and in the United Nations, and you're not holding yourself to your own standards. And so we pushed and pushed. And an area we made the most progress was religious freedom. There had been very limited religious freedom when I first got there. And by the time I left, especially in the cities, but also in most of the countryside, there was freedom of religion. But what there still is not is there's no free press, and there's no freedom to criticize their government. All the way in the back.
Ambassador, could you talk, many people don't realize or remember perhaps that after we were finished with our war in Southeast Asia, Vietnam and China had a little war.
That's right.
So could you talk about Vietnam and China's relationship?
Thank you. The latest war in Vietnam went from 1979 to 1991. It was a border war around Ha Giang province, all along the land border between China and Vietnam. The United States was focused elsewhere during that period. We didn't have a relationship with Vietnam. We were angry at the Vietnamese for having moved into Cambodia and having established an alliance with Russia. We didn't pay that much attention to that war. But every year, thousands and thousands of Chinese and Vietnamese soldiers died on that border. And that is a very fresh conflict in the lives of Vietnamese. But that was war number 22 against China. There have been 3,000 years of wars between Vietnam and China, 3,000 years in which the Vietnamese have pushed for independence, sought their independence from China. I don't know how well this was explained to John F. Kennedy or to Lyndon Johnson. Because if they really thought about it, the domino theory didn't make any sense. This was a country where the people, it's in their DNA to resist the Chinese. And just as recently as 2014, when the Chinese bullied the Vietnamese in the South China Sea, there were thousands and thousands of protesters on the streets. Chinese factories were burned. Any car that had an American flag was fine. Anybody who was expected to be Chinese was in great danger. Because the Vietnamese do not want to be dominated by any foreign power, least of all China. And so that is the rock in Vietnam's creation, existence as a nation, and its foreign policy is resistance to domination by China. And that I would acknowledge has created an opening for the United States. We're far away. We're not going to invade them again. We tried that once and it didn't work. So we're seen as the partner of choice. And there's more military exchange between the United States and Vietnam than Vietnam has with anybody else. We are the security partner of choice of this former enemy. Sir.
So, this is a small question and it probably has a big answer, you don't have time to do it. But I'm really interested in how the transition started. How did they get from where they were in the 70s to now? Was there one person who was like their George Washington kind of a person? Or was it a group of people who got together? Do we even know that? It's just kind of interesting to me how how things progressed over the last.
And you mean mostly on the economic front, how they opened up, or do you mean in terms
Well,
of?
they wouldn't do economics unless other things were going on as well, so, yeah, whatever you think you can answer the question with.
Well, I'm going to start with economics, because I think that helps to explain what happened and why they made the decisions they made. Right after the war, there was the leadership, the leader at the time, the leader of the Communist Party, Lê Duẩn, was very committed to collective agriculture, and it was a flop. And so by the 80s, they had a terrible famine. You can actually tell who survived that famine and who didn't, by looking at people's teeth. Because when you go years without enough food, it has an effect. And that famine led the Politburo to make the decision: we're going to open up our economy. They called the reforms doi mai, and they were economic reforms that involved an opening up and an integration with the world economy. And they pursued this policy of comprehensive economic integration consistently from the 1980s to today. And so when I was first there in the mid-90s, they were only really getting going, but you could see each year growth went up. And then 2008 was the turning point. In 2008, and it just so happened that Euromoney had a big conference of investors at the Daewoo Hotel in Hanoi. You can see the graphs of growth. It goes like this, and in 2008 it goes boom, straight up. So there was an enormous inflow of foreign direct investment starting with 2008. And we had something to do with that. The first ambassador to Vietnam, my boss and a hero whom I write about in my book, Pete Peterson, negotiated a bilateral trade agreement with the United States. And on the bilateral trade agreement, they built the idea that they would join the World Trade Organization, which they did right after signing the trade agreement. And that was what propelled a lot of this interest in Vietnam as an investment, a place for safe investment. And from 2008 on, all that investment has fueled this phenomenal amount of growth, and has fueled this export-led economy, and has led them to just want to open up more. And so that's why they're our #7 trading partner. So they really made the decision to normalize the relationship with us for economic reasons. They wanted to be more prosperous. And then we built trust over time by doing things together. We found ways to accomplish things together that built more and more trust, and that ultimately led to the partnership that we have today. But it required the United States to think about what it is the Vietnamese want, not just what we want. We wanted our fullest possible accounting for those whom we lost during the war. That was the foundation for every bit of progress we made. The Vietnamese wanted access to the world economy. And so on that balance, we were able to create a partnership which I think could endure a very long time. Please.
I appreciate your comments on McCain, incidentally. Colorado Springs being the way it is, you're talking to a room full of people, many of whom served in Vietnam. But here's my question. The Economist has a story about the efforts of the party in Vietnam to eliminate corruption in the government in Vietnam, which raises some complicated questions for Americans politically or in business. Who do you deal with, the party or the government? And then, of course, there is the question of the pervasiveness or not of corruption.
Thank you. So the campaign is led by Nguyen Phu Trong, who's the General Secretary of the Communist Party. And he himself lives kind of ascetic life and is absolutely untainted by corruption. But that cannot be said for the rest of the Communist Party. There is a pervasive problem of corruption. And one of the reasons I actually think the United States has a certain advantage when it comes to building a security relationship is our companies adhere to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We don't bribe. And just a little story to illustrate that. Intel Corporation decided to make a major investment in Vietnam. It's now, I think, over $3 billion. But their biggest overseas plant that produces semiconductors, computer chips, is just outside of Ho Chi Minh City. And when they decided to make this investment, they went to the People's Committee of Ho Chi Minh City and said, we don't do bribes. Understand, we really don't do bribes. And the People's Committee said, we know, we want your investment, we'll protect you, there will be no bribes. Then they were building the foundation of the factory, and they had 25 cement trucks all lined up to go and build the foundation. And they were stopped by a policeman. You know what happens to a cement truck when you stop it? It's not good. And so, you know, as these trucks stopped spinning and they were not able to get to where they were supposed to go, Intel was in a bind. It would have been really easy to pay off this policeman to have their 25 trucks get through to lay the foundation, but they didn't. They called the People's Committee and said, remember our deal? We don't do bribes. The policeman got out of the way. They went in, they laid the foundation, and they were never bothered again. And so to me, that's a really important thing to remember. If you've proven that you don't do corruption, it's better to do business with you. So now we're starting to provide more and more military material. They know that when they procure from the United States, there's going to be no under the table like the Russians do. The Russians have been providing military equipment to Vietnam for a long time. And they've got some nice deals, and there's a payment under the table every time, so they're kind of built-in incentives to buy Russian. But you know what the Russians also do? They don't do any training or any maintenance. So the Vietnamese bought 4 Kilo-class submarines, and the Russians basically turned over the submarines, some Russian language manuals, and said, figure it out. And the Vietnamese flew to Chennai and learned from the Indians how to operate their Kilo-class submarines. Well, they don't really like this deal anymore. And so in December, we sent 5 of our member companies to the Defense Expo in Vietnam. Prime Minister, Minister of Public Security, Defense Minister, all went to see the people, the Americans who had set up booths, talked to them privately, showed their interest, and they're going to be buying American-made helicopters. Imagine that, American helicopters. So there's been a sea change. And they don't want to rely on the Russians anymore. And if it means, you know, giving up the payments under the table, they'll do it. There have been a lot of high-level officials who've been sacked for corruption. And I think what the General Secretary is trying to do is preserve the party. He's a former professor of Marxist ideology and Ho Chi Minh thought. He's not really natural capitalist, but he's learned that relationship with the United States is good, and he's learned that if you let corruption go unfettered, you can kill the party. And so he's fighting it all different ways, including he's fired some people who are friends of mine who I actually don't think were corrupt, but he's had to demonstrate how serious he is about this fight against corruption. Back there, sir.
Is this thing on? Yes, it is. I'm a retired rocket scientist, for real. And I have colleagues in Vietnam who are building and launching satellites, but that's not my question. My question is, when I go to the doctor's office and they have a placard with all the rules and regulations, it's in English and Spanish and Arabic, but not French or Sanskrit or anything else, but Vietnamese.
Vietnamese.
Why is Vietnamese included among those prominent languages?
Well, we have 2.2 million Americans of Vietnamese origin in this country. So that would be my guess. Now, mostly they're concentrated, that community is concentrated in California, Washington State, Louisiana, and Virginia. But there must be a pocket in Colorado, a significant pocket, because think about it, after 1975, an enormous number of people fled Vietnam, came to this country, and Americans were hospitable, very hospitable. Churches opened up, people opened up their homes. And now that community has grown to 2.2 million. Many of them, especially the older generation, aren't so much interested in today's Vietnam. They remember the day when a gold flag, a yellow flag, flew over half what is today Vietnam. And they're not very loyal, they don't feel any loyalty towards the flag, the red flag with the yellow star. That's the whole process of reconciliation, which I write about in my book, really hinges on that community.
I have a not so serious question. Have you ever seen the fire-breathing dragon bridge?
Yes, in Da Nang. And I've seen it breathe fire. It's really great. It's beautiful design, and it spits out fire at one end of the bridge. It's great. Any other questions? Sir?
Thank you so much for the presentation today. And after the war, there were a number of people, military and government workers who were Vietnamese who could not get out of the country.
Yes.
And as I understand it, they had to go through a considerable period of difficulty, re-education camps,
Yes.
things like this. Can you give us an idea of what has happened within a certain range to those people?
I'll start with a story, and it kind of builds on the last question. One of the things that an American ambassador has to do at some point is run the gauntlet and go to a place called Little Saigon, out in Orange County, California. And I kind of girded myself for this experience and went to meet this community of people who had fled that country. And I gave a talk, and I started in Vietnamese. I spoke for a while, and I joked a little bit with the crowd in Vietnamese. That relaxed people, because it's actually a challenging crowd. How about that? I was flanked by Democratic and Republican representatives of Congress, and I turned to the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee and said, "Was that okay?" after the speech, and he said, "Ted, that was great." So I was feeling really good. You know, oh man, I got through this. And the speech had ended, the Q&A period had ended, and a man came up to me. And I would guess he was about 70. And he came up and he grabbed me by the lapels. And he said, "Ambassador," and this is Bang Tien Viet, totally in Vietnamese, "Ambassador, I spent 11 years in a re-education camp." And I said, I'm so sorry, I sympathize. Now I'm ambassador to Vietnam. I don't know if there's anything I can do, but I'm really sorry. He said, "Ambassador, I spent 11 years in a re-education camp." And I said, I sort of stammered something. I'm really sorry. I feel for you. Is there any way I can help? "Ambassador," a third time, "I spent 11 years in a re-education camp." And then it hit me. He wanted that time back. I can't do that. What I could only do was try to do what I could to bring about reconciliation. But I couldn't help him. And he earned the right to oppose reconciliation, to stand where he stood and say, "I suffered too much." And there were many people who suffered too much. But still, I wrote a book about reconciliation because I still believe it's the right thing for our two countries. And I still believe it's the right thing for that man's children and grandchildren to find a way to make peace with that country. But I respect the pain and the suffering that so many people went through. It was very hard to get out of Vietnam after 1975. After that helicopter pulled off from the roof of, it wasn't the roof of the embassy. Yeah, actually it was the roof of the embassy, not the famous picture, but the helicopter that was transporting people out of the U.S. Embassy and out into the South China Sea. But they left thousands of people behind. Thousands and thousands. Interpreters, people who'd worked for us, people who were loyal to us. The children of our soldiers. And I'm going to add one more thing. I was asked as ambassador to facilitate the expulsion from the United States of people of Vietnamese origin, 8,000 people who had orders of deportation, all of whom were refugees. all of whom had fled after 1975, tried to build lives in the United States. Some of whom had made mistakes. You know, you're a young kid, you get to the United States, you don't speak any English, you file papers to get a green card, they get lost, you file them again, they get lost again, you don't speak the language. Some kids got caught up in gangs. So some had been prosecuted for crimes. There was a guy named Tuan who had committed a crime and then spent 3 years in jail, and then built a supermarket chain and had hundreds of people working for him, was paying enormous amounts in taxes to the US government. But the administration said, we're going to deport him back to his country, back to his country. He was loyal to a different flag, not the flag that flies today over Vietnam. So I thought this was about the most un-American thing I could think of. Those people who come and sought shelter here, and the children of our soldiers, and we were trying to deport them. So I had to resign, because in the diplomatic service, you don't get to freelance. If you get an instruction, you have to carry it out or resign. And I kept thinking, if I facilitate the expulsion of these people, how will I look my children in the face? And I resigned, left a career that I loved, because I just could not do that. Could not do that to people who had trusted us. Anyway, sorry, I went off on a little Sir.
Are there other Western countries alongside us now that we have done this reconciliation? Are they in Vietnam with investments and contributions?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's Canada has a free trade agreement with Vietnam. The European countries have developed free trade arrangements with all of ASEAN, but with a special focus on Vietnam. Australia has been a significant investor in Vietnam. It's starting even before the private sector got there, starting with humanitarian projects. So we're far from alone. I really like to think about what's good for America, so I view this sometimes as in a kind of competitive lens. But if you think about it, it really isn't. We're all in it together in terms of developing that country, integrating that country with the world economy. It's been a joint effort. And back to the human rights question, I would meet with my fellow ambassadors every month, and we would plot ways to make it difficult for the Vietnamese government to do what it was doing on human rights. And we were successful sometimes and we failed sometimes, but we did it together. And actually, I worked probably as closely with my Japanese and Korean colleagues as I did with anybody. The Koreans had provided Vietnam with the largest ship in its fleet. Japan was also engaged in both development cooperation and security cooperation. So I worked with those two ambassadors all the time. A little harder time with the Chinese ambassador because his goals were different from mine.
When we were in Vietnam in 2016 on vacation for 3 weeks, I was struck by the poverty in the country as we went around, and then also the fact that, for example, when we visited our guide's home, of course, the police had to be notified, and our guide could not talk freely about the government. With your involvement in business there in Vietnam now, can you comment on how the people feel about their government, and with all the investment of Western money, have things changed for what we consider better?
My answer is yes, things have changed for the better. When I first went there in the mid-90s, not only would the guide be interrogated, but anytime I would go somewhere, I'd have policemen following me. Once I rode a bicycle from Hanoi to Saigon, and they rode the whole way with me, but they were on motorbikes, and I was pedaling. And I was followed anytime I went to on vacation, and actually once, when I was a young political officer, the cops broke into my house just to scare me. So that was those were the early days where they really behaved in a thuggish fashion. I think that eased over time. And I think that there's less paranoia about Americans, and I also think there's less paranoia about people who speak out about the government. But it doesn't mean people don't get arrested. Occasionally they do. They cross the line, they speak too publicly, too critically of the government, and they get arrested. So the problem isn't over, but the trajectory is towards greater openness, greater ability to speak out. And poverty, I understand that where you went was very poor. Poverty has eased mostly in the cities, but it's easing in the countryside too. It's not as bad as it was. And so this comes from looking at the country for 30 years. I am optimistic about the direction it's taking, even though there's still a lot of problems to be resolved.
A few years ago, we had two speakers here from Vietnam. One was from the northern area, one was from the southern area, and they highlighted some of the difference in the mentality and thinking between the two.
Yes.
Has that changed any?
So after a civil war, it takes a long time for the wounds to heal. We know this in our own country. And I would say that the wounds have not healed between North and South. And there's big cultural differences that kind of exacerbate that tension. The South is incredibly industrious and entrepreneurial. Everybody in Ho Chi Minh City has like 2 jobs and they're running a business out of their kitchen and going to night school to learn English. Incredibly, incredibly industrious. Hanoi and the North, kind of more sedate. There's greater focus on scholarship and on history. It's a more Confucian culture. Influenced by China much more, whereas the South, I think, is also influenced by India and by the rest of Southeast Asia. So there are differences in cuisine. In the North, there are 6 tones in the language. In the South, there are 5. And the vocabulary is really different for a lot of very common terms. And then there's this tension that comes from, one side won and the other side lost. And the folks in the South tend to be watched more by the police because there's always this worry on the part of a government that believes in stability overall, that there might be some unrest in the South. And so I've seen terrible protests that were crushed, actually both in the North and the South. When Barack Obama visited, and those 3 days were the highlight of my 30 years as a diplomat, was the visit of President Obama to Vietnam. There were protests prior to the visit, and I'll tell you, they came down really hard on those protesters. They didn't want anything that would mar the visit of the US president, or that would highlight that there was anything that people were not happy about with the government. So it was a challenging visit to orchestrate, but when we landed in Saigon and the President's motorcade came through, there were 1 million people who turned out to greet us. 1 million, and each side of the street, would be like 32 people deep. And the President said, Ted, the only place in the whole world where I might have gotten a warmer reception was Tanzania. He was really embraced. And I think the United States is really warmly embraced in the South. It's a little cooler in the North.
Could you share with us what was the fate of the 8,000 Vietnamese who were threatened with the expulsion from the United States?
So, as long as I was ambassador, I was able to stick sticks in the spokes and slow the bicycle down. People ask, well, is there a deep state? Yeah, in a way there is. I was able to put a bureaucratic drag on those orders from the White House. There was a guy named Stephen Miller, who was advisor to the president, who was driving this policy. And in my view, it was an overtly racist policy. If they were Norwegian, they wouldn't have been trying to get them out of the country. These were not white people. And so the whole time I was there, I wrote to Rex Tillerson, I wrote to Secretary Mattis, I wrote to H.R. McMaster in the White House, and I said, the president's coming for APEC You're going to destroy his trip. You're going to ruin all the progress we've made if you try to do this. And they said, yeah, thanks, Ambassador, shut up. And so I was able to slow it down as long as I was ambassador. And then 6 days before the president arrived, they sent me a one-way ticket and said, you got to go, and you got to be out by Saturday. Well, I didn't particularly want to welcome the president. I was trying to do my duty and make sure that his visit was successful. He was the president of the United States, after all, and I was his representative. But I felt like that was my escape, and that's when I resigned. And unfortunately, then the deportations got going. They didn't get all 8,000 of them, but they were able to get hundreds out. And the people who went to Vietnam, they didn't have jobs. They didn't have families there. All of their lives were in the United States. So a number of them ended up in jail. The New York Times did a number of exposés on this. I went public because I just thought this was reprehensible, and I thought the American people deserved to know what's being done in secret. I went public, and I spoke to the media, I published some things, and there was a big furor, and the White House was really mad. And 4 members of Congress lost their seats in Southern California in heavily Vietnamese American districts. And did that affect the outcome of those races? I don't really know, but I think it did. And once it went into the public sphere, then you had a lot of people speaking up and saying, hey, wait a minute, we fought this war, have you forgotten the history? And the deportations did not end until the Biden administration came in. End of my partisan screed, sorry.
Just one last question.
Please.
Because I have to ask, not many Americans have had a justice renewed.
No. Thank you.
So,
Thank
what's
you.
the story behind that?
So, Roland, thank you. We arrived in Vietnam in December 2014. And I arrived, we were not a typical American family. My husband's black. We had a child whose origins are Mexican-Americans. And my 85-year-old mother was with us. That actually made it so that Vietnamese could identify with us. We were a 3-generational family. What's that in Ba Te He? This is a very common concept in Vietnam. And then we a few months later, we adopted our daughter, also of Mexican-American origin. So we were kind of black, white, brown family. And I think in January, Justice RBG wrote to us and said, I'm coming to Vietnam, can I stay at your house? God, could you ever? And so we wrote back, he said, we would be so honored, we would love it if you would stay at the residence. And then a friend of mine, it was just that time when the decision in the Supreme Court went through, the Obergefell decision, that made my marriage to Clayton legal in all 50 states. We had gone to Canada to get married. And so a friend of mine said, Ted, ask her if she'll renew your vows. Because I'd only been married in Canada. We'd never had any American bless our marriage. And so I wrote to her, and I thought, that's a lot of chutzpah, but I'll ask. And she wrote back and said, I'd be delighted. And then she came and she stayed with us. And in our living room, in the presence of quite a few people, she renewed our wedding vows. And we had kind of thought of this in political terms. It's a conservative society. There are a lot of young people who we heard were inspired by the fact that, we had a family and jobs and were being ourselves, something that many of them couldn't envision. And we had people who came up to us and said, I came out to my parents because of you. And so we were thinking very much in political terms, and it did go viral, and there was a big response within the country. But what we weren't really thinking about was how much it would mean to us, personally. Because at this point, we had a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old, and we understood what marriage meant. It wasn't just about us, it was about these 2 little people, who were like our hearts outside of our bodies. So when in the middle of the ceremony, when we were giving our wedding, exchanging our wedding vows, and once again putting rings on each other's fingers, our son leapt from Dada's arms into Papa's arms, into my arms. And that's when it hit. Oh boy, there's a whole different meaning to marriage now. And so it's very powerful to us personally. And she was extraordinary. She loved our children. She was so kind and gracious with our children. She was also like fierce. She, in the Supreme Court, talking to the Supreme Court of Vietnam and talking to the press, she was fierce. And she had a constitution there, and like well-thumbed constitution, and little tabs, and she would refer, she was very precise about language. She would quote from the Constitution. And after, I guess it was 2016, after the election of 2016, she sent a book to my daughter, Lucy, and the book is called I Dissent, and it's about her life as a justice, Supreme Court justice. And she wrote a note and said, "Dear Lucy, there's been an election, and a different person is now president, and I'm going to do everything I can to stay healthy for the next 4 years." She tried. So anyway, it was very powerful for us. Thank you for asking.